Welcome to Outdrive, folks. I'm your host, Cliff Callis, and each week I'm bringing you actionable marketing insights you can apply to reach, connect with, and convert rural American consumers. Outdrive is powered by Callis, a full-service advertising agency with a focus on marketing rural America. Callis offers a wide range of integrated marketing services, including website development, search engine marketing, social media, video, and digital. We develop strategic and creative campaigns to build your brand and your business, and you can learn more about us at ecallis.com. Now join me in the front seat as we head out on the road to success. Let's go. Hey folks, welcome to Outdrive. We've got another great story to share with you today about life and work in rural America. You know that innovation is alive and well out here in the country, and that's not anything new. Ever since our country was founded, entrepreneurs, inventors, and capitalists have all dreamed big and created even bigger. Who would have thought, for instance, that 100 years ago, the small community of Marshall, Missouri would jump on the map because of the airplane? Remember, 100 years ago. Yet, just a few short years after the Wright Brothers took the first flight at Kitty Hawk, airplanes were being made there. To learn more, you can step back into time at the Nicholas-Beazley Aviation Museum. And if you're lucky, you'll get the guided tour from our guest today, Bryan Berlin. Bryan and I go back a long way to business school at Missouri Valley College. Bryan was on the ag side of business, and I was in communications, but our paths crossed a lot. Today, both Bryan and his lovely bride own their family's century farms, over 100 years in the making. And they're both also on the board of directors of the impressive Aviation Museum on the south side of Marshall. Listen in and learn more about the museum's unique history, how small-town ingenuity can overcome many challenges, how they're telling people about the museum, and more. It's a pretty cool story and an awesome way to spend a couple of hours. So with that, let's meet our guest. Welcome to Outdrive, Bryan.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
I'm excited to have you on here. We have so many cool things to talk about today. And you and I go way back to college, I think, where we first met, and we've stayed in contact over the years. And you're involved in some really neat things. And I think our audience is going to be surprised maybe to hear about some of the things that you're involved in. But let's just kind of start by letting you tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm from Marshall, Missouri, a small town in the middle of our state. At the time, what we're going to talk about, Marshall was a town of about 8,500 people. When you and I were going to college, I think our population was 11,500, and now the sign says 13,500. The town size doesn't look any different to me, but it's rural and it's farm people. We have some of the best farmland in the United States. We just don't have as much of it as maybe Nebraska or some states or Iowa where it goes for miles. We're bordered by the Missouri River. When you look at the Missouri River, the highest curve that it makes across our state is our county. So we're actually bordered on three sides by the Missouri River, which, as you know, was important to the development of the Louisiana Purchase. The Lewis and Clark Exposition started in St. Louis and came right by here twice. So, you know, the river's important. In the beginning, small towns thought they had to be on the river because that's how they got goods and supplies. And that's farming and agriculture and the development of the West all happened. The things we learned in school about westward expansion started where we live.
So you and I met at Missouri Valley College. We were going through business school at the same time and had many of the same classes, many of the same instructors. And for me, looking back, I think it was a great experience. Small college, personal feel. Why'd you choose to stay in the area and go to college?
Well, the way I like to tell it, I went to three schools at College and Careers Night. I went to University of Missouri, and I thought, okay, I'll be nobody there. I went to the University of Missouri at Rolla, and they informed me that they only drank beer on St. Patrick's Day. And I thought, I'm going to have it a little more often than once a year. And then I went to Missouri Valley College, and I thought, wow, I think I could really get along here. I'll know my students, I'll know my professors, and it sounds really personal. So they had actually started a brand new program in agribusiness. And so you were in business in one direction, I was sort of in business in a different direction, and I wouldn't change it for 1 second.
What were some of your takeaways from your college experience that you could talk about?
That I can talk about. Well, let's see here. Okay, I'll rule out the times I got kidnapped and walked back to town. So ironically, when you and I were at Missouri Valley College, the enrollment got to the lowest in its recorded history, which was about 400 students, and 100 of them played football. Now we're up to about 15 or 1600, and the campus looks awesome. But what that allowed was for us to know each other and for us to know our professors. And our professor knew us personally, and they had a real interest in us. And so for me, it was a continuation of how small town high school was for me. People knew me. I had friends. The professor in one of my classes was late because he had started farming. At 5 or 10 after 8, you didn't leave because he wasn't there yet. You knew he was coming and he would get there. Today, I don't think that would happen, but it was a unique time and it gave me experiences that I'll treasure my whole life.
Well, you mentioned the farmland of Saline County, and you mentioned our instructor who farmed. Did you grow up farming?
Yes, I did actually. When I was the first graduate through that agribusiness program, and I went to work for a couple of different farmers. My wife and I each have some farmland in Saline County, and if it's been in the family for over 100 years, it's called a century farm. And we actually have century farms from both sides of our family. And I think that's remarkable that families have held their land together. They may not live on it still, but they've held their land together for that length of time. There's actually one farm, there's more than one, but there's one at Marshall Junction that's been in the family for 200 years. I look at that now as my responsibility to look after the land, and my roots are in Saline County.
Yeah, that's something to be proud of. And it is impressive when a family can hold on to a piece of property for that long. I know that, my grandfather lost his farm during the Depression, and others around him, thrived. And, it's the way that things work out over the years. But to have that commitment to keep it through the good and the bad, because you've seen it all in your lifetime, I think that says a lot about a person and a
Well,
family.
and right now it's crazy. Some of the prices when a farm comes for sale at auction, the prices for farmland are actually unbelievable. And you go to ask yourself, oh my God, why don't I sell out? Because I'm in it for the long haul. It's not for me to buy and sell. It's my family has kept it together. That's my job now.
I think that's cool. I always love talking farming, but today we're going to talk about aviation because what you're involved in Marshall is what I think is truly amazing. When did you get interested in aviation? But is it the history side of it? Because I know you love history.
Absolutely. But in 2002, we were building our house and we're in the country. And on a Sunday afternoon, a car drove in our driveway, and a guy I'd gone to high school with and his wife got out of the car, and the girl blurted out, "We have 3 weeks to raise $60,000 to buy that airplane." And so when she left, I asked my wife, I said, "Do you think Connie smokes marijuana?" And my wife says, "No, I believe that's a true story." And so we checked it out that night with a couple of phone calls, and lo and behold, an airplane that had been built in Marshall, Missouri. The owner had passed away, and his sons had given us the first opportunity to purchase it, and we had 3 weeks to raise $60,000. 3 weeks later, a truck from Marshall and $60,000 went to Oklahoma and brought it back to Marshall, and that started the whole thing.
What kind of a plane was that?
Marshall, Missouri, ironically, 20 years after the Wright brothers, had two people who were visionaries. Russell B. Nicholas and Howard Beasley had served in World War I, and Mr. Nicholas had mechanical interests. He had been car dealers and repairmen and all that. He had purchased some surplus World War I propellers from the government for 50 cents and sold them for $3. And he sold out immediately. When he went to get some more propellers, the government had raised their price to $1, and Mr. Nicholas accordingly went to $6. But he realized that aviation was going to go somewhere. And so the next thing that they did was purchase surplus World War I airplanes and ship them here from Houston, Texas. So aviation, 20 years after the Wright brothers flew a kite at Kitty Hawk, happened in our town. They have developed a civilian flying school, a parts catalog business, and eventually designed their own airplanes. The one that came to Marshall was really, really special. It had an aluminum wing, and it was very lightweight. That allowed it to perform very well and set several records. But out of over 100 that were built, the aviation industry and public knew that this is the only one that's left, and it has been for a long time. And so that's why I called on people to ask for donations. I didn't even have a picture of it, and people gave me money. And when we hauled it home in a truck, we didn't call them all to the airport to see it because it was sort of a basket case. We actually unloaded it in the dark at night and put it in a shed real quick. But it got recovered with fabric over at Warrensburg, and now it's the crown jewel of the museum.
You mentioned the museum. You've mentioned the plane. The plane is in the museum, right? Tell us about the museum.
Okay, so now we own an airplane. We've spent $60,000 and we don't even know what exactly it is. So we started meeting as volunteers in 2002 at 7 in the morning, once a week. And we would talk about, well, where would we keep our airplane now that we have one? Well, it's going to take a pretty good size hangar. And well, gosh, it'd be neat if we had a museum. I said, yeah, but how would we keep the lights on at the museum? Well, what if we had a community center? Then we could have a community center for events as well as have a museum. And we said, well, gosh, that's a great idea. So we threw the plans together at our volunteer meetings at 7 in the morning, and they came up with a price of $3.2 million. And we said, well, gosh, that's cheap. So we started raising money. And when the museum/community center opened in 2007 at $3.2 million, it was completely paid for by private donation.
That's impressive.
At the same time, the local hospital was building a cancer center, a community cancer center that was funded. We have a YMCA that was funded with local donations. Yeah, you think, oh, how could that happen? I'm not sure I could pull it off today, but we did it in 2002 when we started asking for people to help us. Actually, it was actually built. Let's go back to college for a second. When we were doing our very first computer classes with Fortran and punch cards, the computer filled one whole room. The only thing that they really did that was legitimate was the payroll for Quinn Concrete, which was a precast concrete company in Marshall. Our walls for our community center museum were built at Quinn Concrete.
That's cool.
Really cool.
That's a neat connection.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and that, the key punch computing, I mean, that could be a whole nother podcast episode talking about that whole thing. Because we're not even going there today. So you got a plane, and then you got a museum, but that's not the only thing in there, right?
Well, no. And so we actually got the community center side open in 2007, and we started having events there immediately. We'd already had the big paper board like you like to use with the big magic markers. And so we would say, what are we going to have here? Well, we'll have weddings. Weddings a good idea. We'll have Christmas parties. That's a good idea. And say, well, we'll have beer parties. Beer parties a good idea. So we might have wine parties. Well, that's even better. And so lo and behold, we hadn't been open very long, and one of the Marshall firefighters actually passed away. And they called us immediately and said, we will need to use your building for 2 days. And in 2 days' time, 2,500 people were in the building because of the visitation, the funeral, and the family dinner. And so I was standing in the hall with our funeral director, and I said, Jimmy, you never made the list when we were talking about the things we're going to have here. He goes, the day it was built, I knew we would be here. So the building, it happened because of a Marshall plane. And now how do we get along without it?
So I've been through the museum. It is so interesting and, again, so impressive. Talk about the evolution of how you added things to it after that first plane.
So after we had built the building and we had an airplane, we had an open, blank canvas, so to speak. We called some other people in from Kansas City and we said, what would it cost to have you design and do the museum in here? They said, oh, we'd love to do this. $1.8 million. And I thought about that for a while and I thought, you know what? We've raised quite a bit of money. I don't think I'm ready to go there again. So I got a grocery sack out and a pencil and a ruler, and I basically drew the design of the museum. And I designed the features that I thought were really important to tell it as a story. From the World War I surplus to start with, to the flying school, the next thing that was developed to teach more people to fly, to the factory building, to the airplane itself, to the next airplane that they had, and finally a small section on World War II. So we started out as volunteers. We had work nights and we literally built it ourselves. We had extra paint that was left over. The painter wouldn't use it in the community center because it was epoxy and he didn't want to mix part A with part B. He wanted to open a can and paint. So I had all this excess paint that was free. And so we were actually able to use material we had on hand. We found a local artist who would do murals. She did galvanizing metal to make it look like an antique building. She wanted to be involved. And so you don't just go into a vanilla room and see an airplane. You have wonderful color and features that are just really fun for that. And it took us a little while to get that all developed, but we've added things to it as time has gone on. But it's just what it is for me is what you mentioned earlier. It's the history part of it. I didn't, I don't have a pilot's license. Airplanes are okay with me. I like trains more, but I love the history of my town because this is a story I never knew even when I lived here as a young kid. I learned this when I was the donor of $60,000 to go buy an airplane. And I thought, some people have asked me, they said, well, why have you stayed? I said, I guess I wanted to know where my money went. But it's helped me develop the story of Marshall's aviation history. And I say it one more time because it's significant to me. 20 years after the Wright brothers, that's the blink of an eye. Marshall, Missouri is in the aviation business. The civilian aviation flying school that they had attracted over 3,600 people. They would come to Marshall, and Marshall was so involved in it, they would board in people's homes for $6.50. And they would go to the flying school, they would go to ground school, they would go to the factory and learn how the airplanes were built. So, you know, they were really, they could have done what we do today and take your money and give you a piece of paper and say, great, go on, you're a pilot. They were really involved in what aviation was going to become. So what's fun for me then is to give tours now, and we give guided tours. Because if I just turn you loose, you're just going to go out and say, after 10 minutes, oh, you got some neat old stuff. But if I walk you through the museum, all of a sudden it's a story about my town. And it has real names, real places, interesting features that all of a sudden become relevant, even if other people are like me that don't fly or care about airplanes.
Where did all the stuff, where did all the relics, the uniforms, where did all that come from?
Well, unfortunately, we think a lot of it probably disappeared and left Marshall, but I checked this out because I knew you were going to ask me something like that. I always like to give a brief thing on our tour when we go to the catalog area. There's a catalog area where people could order airplane parts, but other airplane companies could order airplane parts. And they made these wonderful catalogs. There are 3 catalogs on eBay right now. You haven't been able to use it since 1935. So why are they out there, Cliff? And they can be in Sedalia, they can be in England, they can be in South America. They are in good shape. They're wonderful to look at. But why on earth? Because Nicholas-Beazley sent a lot of them out. I mean, they were way ahead on marketing. And the other thing I'd like to tell people, people are so impressed now with Amazon. So I order my stuff today, it might be here tomorrow. Nicholas-Beazley was even ahead of the game on that. They shipped things by train, and every town at that time in America had a train station. If they filled your order today and got it to the train station, it's entirely possible you were going to get it tomorrow, and if not, the next day. And so people go, wow, this is all cool because it just happens with Amazon. No, no, no. Nicholas-Beazley was trying to do that and do good business years ago. So those kind of things are what really make it interesting for me, the whole concept of how they were doing business and the type of business that they were doing in a farm town.
So if people are listening right now and are interested to learn more, where would they go? Obviously they go to the internet, right?
Yes,
what are they going to punch in to find you?
nicholasbeazley.org. That'll bring up our website for our information about the museum. There'll be some pictures and hopefully some things that will entice you to come to Marshall to learn more about it. After the first airplane was built and certified with the aluminum wing, the stock market crashed. As we all know, we had the Great Depression. And so that greatly affected aviation. Nicholas-Beazley hung on, and in 1931, they still wanted to try to build airplanes because they had a beautiful factory set up for that. They hired a different designer. The first airplane cost $3,600. Before the stock market crashed, that was a pretty good buy. Well, after the stock market crashed, they had to build one cheaper. And not everybody knows that Sam and Bud Walton went to grade school in Marshall, and they may have given the hint to Nicholas and Beazley how to sell things cheaper. They designed an airplane in 1931 that only cost $2,000. And they were able to build 58 more airplanes before they stopped production. And from that model, 5 of the 58 have survived. So there's one in New York at an airplane museum. There's one in St. Louis. Creve Coeur has an airplane museum. There's one there. Marshall has 2, and one of our board members has one in Kansas City. So of the 6 known airplanes that are left from Marshall, volunteers have seen possible for 3 of them to come back home.
That is neat.
It's unbelievable, really.
Well, when you think about it, it is. You're right. You have this website where people can come, and of course they can come and check it out. How
Yes.
else are you telling the story about the Nicholas-Beazley Aviation Museum?
We actually went in July to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Oshkosh, Wisconsin has an annual fly-in that they call Air Venture that this year attracted 677,000 people. It's like the state fair at Sedalia, only about one item, aviation. So we actually had a booth at Oshkosh Air Show. The airplane from Kansas City was hauled up to there and assembled to be on display. It didn't fly. We haven't had one flying in over 20 years, but we were able to sort of spread the word because that's the most difficult thing for us is trying to get the word out that the 2 saddest things for me at the moment are that younger people don't think they want to go to a museum because it's just old stuff. And some people might think, why would I go to an aviation museum? I really don't care about airplanes. And so I will get those people, and after an hour, they'll say, oh my gosh, this is the best kept secret I've ever heard, and I don't want to leave. And I said, yes, but you didn't want to come when you got here, if you remember that. But when I can give names and relevance to it, all of a sudden they're hooked and they don't think they're going to like it, and they turn out they do. So trying to get the people in the front door is a real challenge because we are in a rural area. We do call it an aviation museum, but the story is more about people. And for instance, I told you I would give you a little hint here in a minute. One of the guys that came to Marshall, he really came just to get parts. He had an airplane from North Dakota. He needed some parts. He landed in Marshall, and his name was Dwight Samuel Zimmerly. And he needed some parts. And the next thing they started talking, and he was a pretty good pilot. They hired him to be their test pilot and their chief instructor in the flying school. Well, he actually flew the very first airplane with the aluminum wing nonstop from Brownsville, Texas to Winnipeg, Canada in 16 hours and set a altitude record for nonstop flight. And he went to almost 28,000 feet over St. Louis in the identical airplane. Eventually, his daughter, Virginia, married Norm Stewart, the basketball coach from the University of Missouri. So actually, Coach Stewart has been to our museum several times and actually had a bust of Barney Zimmerly done in Columbia by Sabra Tull Meyer that is out of this world. And so, that's just a unique feature. Barney Zimmerly flew commercial airliners after that, 4 million miles in his lifetime, and lived to be 96 years old. So by being careful and being a good pilot, he lived a full life.
Well, that's a great
So,
story. I'm sure one of many that
yes,
you tell people as part of this. So, how is the museum funded? Is it self-sustaining? Do you accept donations from people that are interested in contributing?
yes. Like I told you, it's amazing that volunteers raised the money to build the whole building. We're in partnership with the city, so the city actually gets the revenue from the rental side of the facility, and they help us then with some of the upkeep. But the operation of the museum is solely on us as volunteers. So volunteers have seen it necessary and important to raise the money to do the things we've done. We have had several smaller grants. There was a relative of one of the former employees that set up a foundation here in Marshall that has helped us a little bit, but that is something that we talk about. We do have a small endowment fund that we would like to see grow, but it's volunteers and it's by donation. There's a small fee. I say small fee. It's a $10 fee to go to the museum. When you think about after spending an hour there to keep the lights on and learn that history, I think that's a bargain.
Agreed. Agreed. So, if somebody wants to donate online,
Yeah.
they go to your website
Yeah.
and there's
Yes, they
opportunities.
can do that. And I'll tell a quick story, and it's sort of it's an interesting story and it's a sad story. A relative of one of the other teachers from the flying school was a good friend of mine. He had been a patent lawyer for Goodyear Rubber, and I won't mention names, but he had been here every year because they have a century farm. And I had nurtured a wonderful relationship with him. And when he would bring his family, his brother and their family, he would give me a nice donation. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, when he's gone, he's going to remember us, and this is going to be a wonderful thing. He passed away, and unexpectedly, he had set up a trust, but he only got one minivan on cinder blocks in his trust. So it's important for someone to think about the keeping something alive after you're gone, to make sure that that is written down and followed through, because up until that point it's only words. And if that doesn't happen, then you're still hoping that the next guy will remember you and make it possible for other people to see that.
I think that's a great point to make. I think if there's anything that you're passionate about and if you want to see it go forward,
Yes.
then put some love behind it, right?
Yeah. And you don't have to make the donation now, but at some point when you're no longer with us, if it was important to you and you wanted it to continue, other people will benefit from that. And that's it was a lesson for me that, oh my gosh, you have to make the ask to make sure that that happens.
Yeah, that's a great point. You've had a lot of successes in building your museum really from the ground up. What would be maybe the one or two highlights of all the successes you've enjoyed over the last 20 years?
Well, I think when Norm Stewart came to my house for dinner and could tell stories, and we've set up a table for 35 people in our living room, and he was having a ball. It was a weeknight, and he said, "Son, if you eat like this on Wednesday, what do you do on Saturday?" And I said, "Norm, we sit on the back porch and have chili dogs." And he said, "I want to come on Saturday too."
That's awesome.
And then we had a man come through with a vintage airplane for airplane rides. And when Norm Stewart came through the door, he called me by name. And, you know,
Means a
it was
lot.
just fun to be yeah, that's really cool. The successes are what we've accomplished with preserving the history of Marshall. A year ago, two of us went to New Hampshire. The airplanes that Nicholas-Beazley sold that were surplus from World War I were large versions of what the Wright brothers flew. They were big wooden framed airplanes. In order for a wooden framed airplane to stay rigid, there's lots of cabling and bracing to hold it all in place. And so they sold these airplanes and they would land in Sedalia or Marshall, give airplane rides, park it behind the barn, do it again tomorrow. And that was called barnstorming. That was all going really well until there was an accident, maybe a second accident, and then someone passed away. And then the government said no more airplane rides in wooden framed airplanes. So that's what led to the airplane design that Nicholas-Beazley had with an aluminum wing. Well, if you Google J1 Standard, which is the name of the wooden framed airplanes, it says in Google about 1,600 were built. At the bottom of the Google article, it says about 12 have survived. So a year ago, two of us went to New Hampshire and literally in a barn hauled home most of a J1 Standard. So we're now going to be able to preserve and refurbish that to show that as how they started and how barnstorming gave the thrill of a ride to lots of people. It's hard to find one if there's only 12 in the country. I'm not sure they knew about the most of one we hauled home in a U-Haul truck, but it's fun that we were able to find one. And the guy wanted it to come here.
So you keep adding new things to the museum?
Yes, we do. So, for instance, during COVID, I had a wonderful phone call from a man in California, and he identified himself as the grandson of the designer of the airplane, whose name was Walter Barling. And he said, I'm cleaning out my grandmother's garage, and I have two pieces of tail plus an oil painting of Mr. Barling. I want to send those to you. I said, put them on a pallet. I'm good for the freight. So we did that. He didn't even send me cell phone pictures. That's how gullible I am. So here's a truck that pulls into our parking lot, and we unload this 8-foot pallet. And I'm thinking, wow, that's a pretty big tail on this thing. So we unwrap the top part of it, and here's a gorgeous oil painting of Walter Barling. So we take that out and we start unwrapping the bubble wrap, and it turns out it's not pieces of tail, it's a full structural model in miniature of the Barling wing before they built it in full size.
How
And
cool
instead
is
of going
that?
in a dumpster, it came back to Marshall. It's every detail is on it in miniature as the full thing. That's crazy.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
Yeah.
So,
So we like to add things like that that kind of help more tell more about the story. And the story's interesting whether you like airplanes or not. It's a people story. And it's a people story when Marshall was very industrious and people got on board with the idea that aviation was really going to become something big.
that was pretty visionary. So, what are the plans
It
for the
was.
future?
Plans for the future. Well, we were optimistic when we built the museum that it wouldn't be big enough. And so actually, the south end of the museum is a great big, what's called a bifold door so that you could get airplanes in. But if we pushed that door farther south and got some more concrete panels from Quinn Construction, we could actually expand the museum. And so we would like to see that as a need. There are a couple of things we would kind of like to have that are aviation to the Marshall story related. What I've seen when I travel sometimes is you'll see a sign for an airplane museum or an aviation museum, and it turns out to be Dr. Callis's collection of airplanes. And so after the 60th airplane, it can be a little monotonous. Our story is not that. Our story is really unique to Marshall. It is the story of Marshall's aviation history and the people that were involved in it. Now, I've had people come to tell me that a relative of theirs went to the Marshall Flying School. We've only been able to come up with about 250 of the names. We've never found complete records, which I wish we could. to prove, to show the people, yes, this is your relative, but they know it because they have proof of it at home. So expansion would be something that we dream of. We would like to tell a little bit more about as we have more things to put in the museum, and just to get the word out to more people that we're here and it's an interesting story. I think you'll like it.
And they can follow you on Facebook, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we're on Facebook as well. Yep.
Well, and I think, one of my favorite sayings, and people who listen to the podcast or who know me hear me say, you never know. You never know who's going to come across with some new relic or
Yeah.
thing that's going to fall into your museum, right? You just never know when that's going to happen.
You never know when that's going to happen. Just and that's the same way with the Barling pieces that came back. But if people will take a chance on it, you never knew that you were going to have a good time and like it, because it has people in it. It's not just a collection of static airplanes sitting there. There's a story why they're there, and the story why it happened in our town. And to go back just a little bit to the Wright brothers, two guys from Dayton, Ohio, took their vacation at Kitty Hawk, and they flew a kite. Let's be honest, it's a kite. It's a big wooden kite with cloth on it for about a minute. They went back to Dayton, and it took them 2 years to figure out how to make it turn and turn it off. They didn't even have a shutoff switch. They would fly it at Dayton until they ran out of gas. That's how crude it was in the beginning. Two guys that never finished high school solved aviation. But 20 years after that, Marshall, Missouri had a modern plant, a civilian flying school, a parts catalog business. So aviation started out as a small snowball, but it really picked up steam as it rolled along. And it's just fun for people to experience that.
That's a great story. And that's what I like doing on our podcast is, everybody's got a story, and I just love sharing them. And of course, this is all happening in rural America. Marshall's small, very nice community in the middle of Missouri. And it's a part of the greater rural America that we know and love. And so when I say those words, rural America, what kind of thoughts and images come to your mind?
Well, here's what Mr. Nicholas thought. Mr. Nicholas thought if a guy's smart enough to be a mechanic on a tractor and a plow, he can probably be a mechanic on an airplane. And you go, wow, that's kind of oversimplifying it. Yeah, but it's still a mechanical guy, and it's actually pretty true. Because in the beginning, airplanes weren't quite as sophisticated as they are now with Garmin and autopilot and all that stuff. A guy was still a mechanic, and he had lots of skills that happened in Marshall. They did all types of welding, and they had a press to corrugate metal. They had envisioned building 40 airplanes a week in Marshall. That's how set up they were. Rural Americans get things done. They figure out a way to do it, and they go do it. Farmers are the same way. They feed the world, and they do it, and it's hard work, but it's the work that they've taken on. And I love living in rural America. And if you'll slow down and get 10 miles off of Interstate 70 for an hour, I'll tell you the story about our town, and I think you'll get a kick out of it.
There you go, folks. Private invitation from Bryan Berlin for a guided tour of the Nicholas-Beazley Aviation Museum. Bryan, I've really enjoyed visiting with you. I always enjoy when we talk. What else would you like to share with our Outdrive audience that you think they might find interesting?
Well, I love rural America, but I love rural Missouri because the Missouri River is an important thing. Names of people that we talked about in school that were just names. For instance, Kit Carson, Daniel Boone, John Coulter, the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Boones made salt in my area. Kit Carson came from New Franklin, 25 miles from where I live. John Coulter was from New Haven, where my mom's parents were from. The Lewis and Clark went up the river and came back. They didn't have, their Garmin was not working. They did that by sheer skill and determination. To me, that's fascinating how this part of the country developed from St. Louis west, and it happened right through here. The Santa Fe Trail started where we live. How in the world can you ride a wagon with wooden wheels all the way to Santa Fe and come back and know where you're going? I can show you outside of Marshall, there's a little place called Grand Pass. And I love to tell this. It's a quick story. I won't run you for long. We have a river called the Missouri. We have another smaller river in Saline County called the Salt Fork River. The Grand Pass is the narrowest point between those two rivers where the Santa Fe Trail people knew they didn't have to cross either one. It's like they knew we won't cross either creek if we go in this place. Let's call it the Grand Pass. That's awesome to me. So, history is fun if you can tell it in a story. If it's just old things to go look at, it isn't going to take very long.
You've done a great job of telling the story, Bryan. I appreciate having you on the show.
Well, I've enjoyed every bit of it, and I hope you can come. Some people will come to Marshall and learn it in person because we'll let them look up close and touch some things and see some things, and they'll learn a little history about where I live.
I hope they'll be there soon. Folks, thanks for listening to Outdrive. I hope you've enjoyed our visit today with Bryan Berlin, Executive Manager of the Nicholas-Beazley Aviation Museum. Come back again next week, and I'll take you down the roads of rural America, where it's heaven on earth.
Thanks for taking a ride with us on Outdrive. This episode is complete, so head on over to ecallis.com for more insight you can apply to help drive your business growth. And be sure to sign up for our free monthly e-letter, Outthink, for even more helpful content about marketing to rural America. Have a great day and keep on driving.